Hello everyone and welcome to the channel where I make fun, weird things. Today, I'll be making a creature from Zoochosis, a video horror game. There are many monsters in this game. Today, I'll be making the zombified moose monster. If you don't know what I'm referring to, then I guess you're here to actually see me sculpt, and not just because of the title. Let's just start off by making a wireframe. I do not make a wireframe for the entire body, just for the front two legs and the horns to give them support. I then use tinfoil to create the body and back legs. I bend and cut the wires up the front legs to make them the appropriate length. I adjust the legs to where I want them. I bulk up the back legs but keep the main front legs pretty much barren, as they are rather skinny. I definitely did not forget about the giant gaping hole in the creature's back, and definitely planned ahead to cut this hole into the tinfoil. After coating it in a layer of tinfoil, I move on to adding clay. I start by flattening a piece of clay. Once that is done, I begin to cover the creature. I take my time smoothing the clay now so I don't have to in the future. Once the body is completely covered, I move on to the skull. The skull splits in two, but I make a full skull first, sculpting it to make sure both sides are symmetrical, but also to make sure that it is in the right proportion before I cut it in half. I fiddle around with it for a little while to make sure I got some of the shapes right, before cutting it in half. I then secure both face pieces and jaw to the head, making sure that they can stand on their own and won't fall over. Once the skull is done, I think it's time to move on to the horns, since they are a main focal point of the piece. I do a combination of stretching, pulling, and cutting the horn in order to make tiny little spikes. Then carve the holes into the horns. Now, with the support of our wire, we can place the horn on top of the moose's head without worry of it breaking or falling off. I then repeat the process for the other side. Now that the horns are out of the way, I think it's time to add proper feet onto this guy. Once I'm satisfied with the hooves, I add a little bit of muscle onto the front legs, since they're looking very barren right now. After that, I begin indicating where the ribs will be. I start with my finger to make sure that there's a distinct area between the shoulder blade and where the ribs begin. Then I take my needle tool and make harsh lines to create the ribs. Once I finish the ribs, I begin working on the patches of fur on its body. I use my thumb and nail for most of this process to make sure that there's a distinct difference between the big, thick patches of fur and the muscle underneath. During this time, I also bulken up the shoulders a little bit, since they're not very pronounced right now. I then take my needle tool to make a line between the fur and body to make sure that there's even more distinction between the body and the fur. After that, I create the eye sockets in the skull, and also the teeth on the side. Once all that is done, I do the nitty-gritty work of double-checking everything, making sure everything is smooth and all the muscles are detailed, making sure that there aren't any harsh edges or lines, and that every muscle is in place, where I want it to be. This is also when I do the dental work on the bottom jaw. This is when I look at my reference image, and realize I forgot the moose's turkey-like gobbler under its throat. But a few pinches later, and the gobbler is there. You either hate or love this step, there's nothing in between. Now begins the satisfying yet tedious part of texturing all the little hairs onto the patches of fur we just created. Once that is done, I add all the dangly meat bits. I double check all the muscles, and then redefine all the harsh lines. I double check everything before beginning the very tedious task of adding all the sharp rows of teeth down the spine. It's important that I find a good balance between sharpness and frailness, that way the teeth don't fall off later. At the point where the mouth merges with the spine again, it becomes way too small for me to fit my finger inside of the small gap. So I use a needle in order to place the teeth inside and smooth them onto the body so they don't fall off. It can be hard to get the small clay onto the needle without it falling off, but this is a great method for making small details if your finger doesn't fit between the gaps of small things. After making the teeth, now it's time to make the spikes along his back. He has several of these large spikes, which presumably are other teeth, if I had to guess, but realistically, they could be anything. Originally, I had placed the spikes haphazardly, not really caring about how well they stick or anything, until all of them are on. That's when I grab my needle tool and put harsh indents into them. That way it kind of looks like they're poking out from the fur. After that, I add the eyes, placing them inside of the sockets, and then blending them inside, that way they don't fall out. And then carefully carving the pupil and the iris. Then I decide to add a little bit of detail to the horns and also the skull by adding a few harsh lines. That way, when I paint it, there will be crevices for the darker shades of paint to seep into and give just a little bit more depth and texture to the skull and the horns so they're just not smooth. I double check everything one last time before it's finally time to put this in the oven. I begin with a red paint that is slightly diluted with brown. I had to be extra careful when painting around the teeth. I didn't want to break any of them, so I diluted my paint with water and let the paint run into the crevices that I couldn't reach. After I thoroughly coated the muscle with red paint, it was time to move on to the fur. Now the fur in the image is a mixture of a blackish brown, but I just settled for brown, because I knew that later on when I shaded the creature, the fur would darken it into the color that I wanted. Again, painting around the teeth was definitely the hardest part, since I didn't want to accidentally break any of the tiny pieces. After that, I mixed together some browns and yellows to make this nice tan color for the antlers. I paint his skull gray, and then his hooves brown. After that, I paint his ribs and tailbone. I can't forget about the little meat bits by his eye, so I paint those red as well. I touch up everything excluding the teeth that I'll paint later. Now comes the very messy part of shading everything. The way I shade is by taking very diluted black paint and covering the entire project over it. That way all the dark paint seeps into all the little crevices. Under his belly and neck, the paint will be slightly darker, but everywhere else will just get a light brushing. After making a very thorough mess of my desk, I clean up my spot and begin to more deliberately shade and lighten up areas. I use white for the highlights and either brown or black for the shading. Now for my personal favorite part, the very satisfying task of coloring in all the teeth. Once that is complete, we are nearly finished. The last step is to do touch-ups along the body. Right here, I begin adding highlights to the fur, and then along the rest of the body on the muscles. I regret not using a pink instead of the white, just because it loses a bit of its color. After painting the eyes and touching up the rest of the body, I go around and add harsh highlights to hopefully make everything look shiny. I think I might have gone overboard with the amount of shiny spots. You'll have to tell me in the comments below what you guys think, if I used too much or just enough. Then after that, we are basically finished. Now it's time for the beauty shots. Off camera, I added these drooly bits with hot glue. But aside from that, this project is finished. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.